Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskrityam Naram Chaiva Narottamam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Udiraye. Srinvatam Swagata Krishna Punya Shravana Kirtana. Yantasto hi avadhani vidunoti suhitsatam. नष्टप्रायेषु अभद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया भगवते उत्तमश्लोके भक्तिर्भवति नैष्टिकी. So today we are summarizing chapter 26 from Canto 4, titled King Puranjana goes to the forest to hunt and his queen becomes angry. नमो विष्णुपदाय कृष्णप्रस्थाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्ति वेदांत स्वामी नामने नमस्ते सरस्वती देवी गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्य देशतारिणे जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासदि गौर भक्तवृंद हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे 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 राम 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 हरे हरे. I'd like to seek blessings from all the assembled Vaishnavas and thank you for giving me this opportunity to purify myself. Please forgive me for any shortcomings. So in this chapter is titled King Puranjana goes to forest to hunt and his queen becomes angry. So this chapter is a very small chapter with only 26 verses. Um, in the first few verses talks about Puranjana goes to the for hunting on a chariot, and then verses 4 to 10 talks about Puranjana hunts in the forest. Then verses 11 to 20 talks about Puranjana returns home, and last few verses talks about how Puranjana pacifies his wife. So in the background, Narad Muni continues the allegorical narration about King Puranjana, who represents the conditioned soul, and his wife, the queen, here representing intelligence and mind, and their interactions symbolize how the soul is, guided or misguided by the material intelligence. So, so in the first few verses, it talks about Puranjana goes to hunt on his chariot. This analogy, talks about how, Jiva in this material body, you know, so once upon a time, King Puranjana went to the forest, mounting his chariot. Here, those first three verses beautifully describes, Puranjana representing the soul, and chariot is a body, and Puranjana goes with a golden armor, and the chariot's golden decorations, which represent the Rajoguna, and the two explosive arrows he carries represents the ego, and also a possessiveness, and the five arrows uh, talks about represents five activities of Gnanendriyas, and the horses, five horses moving quickly, um, represents the five Gnanendriyas, easily attracted by the senses. Two wheels represents the sinful and pious activities, and the flags, three flags represents the three modes of material nature, and the five supports representing the five life aids. Rain represents the mind, driver represents the intelligence, the sitting places represents the heart, and there are seven coverings called seven dhatus, and five different motions of chariot represents the five activities of karmendriyas, and it's also five obstacles. Is uneven roads represents the five kinds of air passing within the body, prana, apana, udana, samana, and vyana. And the 11 commanders represent the 10 senses and the mind. And the destination here, the forest named Panchaprastha, five sense objects. So here, how the material body of the living entity is under control of the three qualities of external energy. And King Puranjana, went to forest to kill humans. This means that, the living entity, came under the influence of mode of ignorance, and, the forest in which king, engaged in hunting was named Panchaprastha. So, and in the coming verses, it's almost impossible for King Puranjana to give up the company of his queen, even for a moment, but nonetheless, you know, uh, he became very much inspired by desiring to hunt. He took up his bow and arrow with a great pride, went to the forest, not caring for his wife. So here it says that, um, so King Puranjana abandoning the company of his religiously married wife, who is is the representative of the conditioned soul's attempt to hunt for many women for sense gratification. Um, Here in Purple Prabhupada says that Kshatriya kings are sometimes advised to go to forest to hunt ferocious animals, just learn how to kill, but such forays are never meant for sense gratification. And killing the animals to eat their flesh is forbidden for the human beings. So, coming to the next verse, in the verse 5 talks about how Puranjana influenced by his demoniac propensities, and his heart becomes very hard and merciless, and without consideration, he killed many animals. And verse 6 and 7 talks about scriptural regulations on followers of the scriptural restrictions um, and ones who don't follow the scriptural restrictions also, especially the verse 6 talks about scriptural regulations on animal killing. If the king is too attracted to eating the flesh, he may do that as per scriptural direction. And also the animals suitable for sacrifice that should be killed, and it should be only killed in the forest and only as much as required. So here, if in the analogy, right, if you see that, similarly the jiva is allowed to enjoy the sense objects, but in a regulated way, but not for, fullest extent. So that's how we have a regulative principles to follow. And in verses 7 to 8, showing the results of following and not following the scriptural regulations. And verse 7 specifically tells that if one follows the regulation, scriptural restrictions, um, what happens, one who works according to the knowledge of the Vedic scriptures, and it is not contaminated by his activities and their reactions. So, but whereas in the verse 8 talks about when one doesn't follow the scriptural regulation and one who acts whimsically and it's influenced by pride and bound by those actions, then they falls down by the influence of the three gunas and they lose the intelligence and sinks down to the samsara. And whereas, merciful people, the citizens are aggrieved and could not tolerate the Puranjana's ghastly killing of the animals. And Puranjana kills so many animals and he become tired. And the next subsequent section talks about how Puranjana returns to the home and appeases his aggrieved wife. Here, it talks about really how the jiva regains his dharmic intelligence. So here in this chapter, right, describe that in how Jiva sometimes give up the proper intelligence under the influence of ignorance. He become attached to the forbidden objects and how he regains that discrimination. So now in this verses 11 to 26, it's talk about how Jiva regains his dharmic intelligence, and each verse talks about Puranjana's activity and each has a spiritual significance. Verse 11 talks about he become angry and thirsty, returning the home, takes a bath and eat the suitable food. That represents that he troubled by his sinful activities. He gave up the sinful activities established in himself in the dharma, and he calls the brahmanas and does perform the atonements, and he gave up eating the meat and taking the liquor, and he has somewhat steady in his process. And then verses 12 talks about how Puranjana decorated himself with the ornaments, sandal pulp, and garlands. This is compared to, he's gaining his knowledge of religion and the self, and he's remembering the king. That means his intelligence is being used in proper sense. And the wife of King Puranjana was lying on the ground because she was neglected by her husband. Actually, woman must always protected by her husband. And as we always speak of goddess of fortune as being placed on the chest of Narayana, in other words, wife must remain embraced by her husband. Thus, she becomes beloved and well protected. Just as one saves his money and places it under his own personal protection, one should simply protect his wife by his own personal supervision. Just as intelligence is always within the heart, so a beloved chaste woman should always have her place on the chest of good husband. So this is the proper relationship between husband and wife. A wife is therefore called Ardhangi in or half of the body. So as Narada continued, dear Prachina Barhi, as soon as King Puranjana saw his queen laying on the ground, appearing like mendicant, he immediately become bewildered. In other words, he repented that he had neglected his intelligence and engaged himself in the forest in killing animals. So, in other words, when one good intelligence is separated or neglected, he fully engages in sinful activities, and due to neglecting one's good intelligence or Krishna consciousness, one becomes bewildered and engages in sinful activities. Upon realizing this, the man becomes repentant. So here in the purport, Prabhupada, quote of quotes as described by Narottama Dasa Thakura, he says that um, he repents for having spoiled his human life and knowingly drunk the poison. So by not being Krishna consciousness, one willingly drinks the poison of material life. So you know this is that one certainly becomes addicted to sinful activities when he becomes devoid of his good and chaste wife, or when he lost his good sense, does not pay Krishna consciousness. And King was very much regretted having left his queen, having gone to the forest to execute sinful activities. When a person regrets his sinful activities, the abandoning of Krishna consciousness and good intelligence, his path of deliverance from the path of material touches is open. So now the coming to the last few verses, Puranjana pacifies his queen. So it says in the purport that one has to awaken his Krishna consciousness first by regretting his past deeds. Just as King Puranjana began to flatter his queen, one should, by deliberate consideration, raise himself to the platform of Krishna consciousness. To attain such end, one must touch the lotus feet of spiritual master. Krishna consciousness cannot be achieved by self endeavor. One must therefore approach self realized Krishna conscious person and touch his lotus feet. So Prabhupada quoted about Prahlad Maharaj verse from Bhagavatam. One cannot come to Krishna consciousness unless he touches the dust of lotus feet of a person who has become a Mahatma, a great devotee. This is the beginning of surrendering process. Lord Krishna wants everyone to surrender unto him. The surrendering process begins when one touches the lotus feet of bona fide spiritual master, and by rendering service sincerely to him, one begins his spiritual life, and also by touching the lotus feet of spiritual masters mean giving up one's false prestige and unnecessary puffed up position in the material world. So those who remain in the darkness of material existence due to falsely prestigious positions, so-called scientists and philosophers are actually atheists. So they don't know the ultimate cause of everything. Although bewildered, they are not ready to surrender themselves to the lotus feet of feet of a person who knows things in their proper perspective. So, in other words, one cannot arouse Krishna consciousness simply by his own mental speculation. One must surrender to a bona fide spiritual master. In the next few verses, it talks about when master accepts a servant as his own man, but does not punish him for his offense, the servant must be considered unfortunate. Here, King Puranjana took his punishment dealt by his wife, and the queen the mercy upon him. So, like a real devotee thinks in this way. When devotee is put in an awkward position, he takes it as a mercy of Supreme Lord. And as popularly quoted words from 10th canto, Tatyenu Pampam Susumkshamano. What this verse states is that, devotee accepts the reversal of his position in the life as a benediction by the Lord and consequently offers the Lord more obeisances and prayers, thinking that this punishment is due to his past misdeeds and the Lord is punishing him very mildly. And the punishment awarded by the state or by God for one's faults is actually for one's own benefit. So in Manu Samhita also it is said that king should be considered merciful when he condemns a murderer to death, because a murderer punished in this life becomes free. So in summary, Puranjana went to hunting expedition. Here, the king, overcoming by passion, he goes to the forest to hunt. He kills many innocent animals, become excited and restless. In symbolically, here, hunting is a sinful, violent activities performed under the influence of lust and passion. The Bhagavatam warns that killing animals unnecessarily creates heavy karmic reaction and degrades the soul. And the next thing is the queen's anger. While Puranjana is awful in hunting, the queen feels neglected. She becomes disturbed, angry, and dissatisfied, representing how the mind becomes restless when not engaged properly. And upon returning, the king rises, tries to approach her, but she resists, being upset with his behavior. And the here next, the Puranjana reaction is like king realizes that he cannot live without his wife's favor. Thus, in comparison, how the soul becomes enslaved by dictates of the mind and senses, even to point of losing independence and dignity. So in this allegory, right, the king representing the soul, queen representing the intelligence and mind, hunting represents the material enjoyment and sinful activities, and anger of queen is mind disturbed by when it is neglected. And when it kings, do his submission, then soul's helpfulness depends on material desires. So when the soul forgets Krishna, it becomes dominated by material intelligence and run after, sense enjoyment, which lead to sufferings. So the key takeaways is, violence and sense indulgence drag souls deeper into the bandage. Attachment to mind and senses makes ones lose their independence, dignity, and higher purpose. And flattering and serving the senses keeps the soul trapped in the cycle of birth and death. But the real freedom comes when the soul redirects its service from material desire to devotional service to Krishna. So I think with that I can conclude, and please forgive me for any shortcomings and misunderstandings. Vancha kalpatarubhya